Here's how you know you're talking to someone from the Oregon Trail generation. They remember using payphones, but can troubleshoot your Wi-Fi router. They laugh when you mention Napster or dial-up internet, but also when Gen Z asks what a floppy disk is. They're fluent in both analog and digital. They code switch effortlessly, and nobody knows they exist. If you were born between 1977 and 1985, you're part of a micro-generation that history forgot to name. Too young to be full Gen X, too old to be a millennial. You're a xennial, the Oregon Trail generation, the last people on Earth who will remember what life was like before the internet took over. And here's what nobody tells you. Your psychology is one of the most unique of any living generation. Not because you're special, but because you experienced something that will never happen again. You had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. You lived on both sides of the greatest technological shift in human history. And that created a brain that works differently than everyone else's. Picture this. You're 10 years old. It's 1987. You're sitting in computer class, staring at a green-tinted Apple II screen. The teacher loads up the Oregon Trail. You and your classmates name your characters, stock up on supplies, and set off on a pixelated journey where dysentery kills more pioneers than you can count. This was your introduction to technology. Clunky, slow, a novelty. Computers weren't in your home yet. They were something you used at school for an hour on Fridays. You typed on actual typewriters in typing class. You researched papers using card catalogs in the library, pulling out long wooden drawers and flipping through thousands of index cards to find a single book. According to Anna Garvey, who coined the term Oregon Trail generation, you grew up remembering a time before the digital age, but barely. You used payphones. You showed up at friends' houses without warning because you couldn't text first. You had to actually talk to their parents before you got to speak to them. And if you wanted to see photos you'd taken, you waited at least an hour, sometimes a week. But then everything changed. Fast. By the time you hit college, Napster existed. You spent nights downloading entire albums in 5 minutes on the university's Ethernet, mouths hanging open at the speed. MySpace launched in 2003. Facebook opened to college students in 2004. According to research, if you were born in 1981 or 1982, you were literally the last graduating class to finish college without social media being part of the experience. And this timing? It shaped your brain in ways researchers are only beginning to understand. Psychologists describe Xennials as having generational fuzziness, your cuspers. People who fall between two major generations and exhibit traits of both. According to researcher Melissa Kemp-Taylor from the University of Louisville, this overlap creates a unique collective personality. Anna Garvey describes you perfectly. You have both a healthy portion of Gen X grunge cynicism and a dash of the unbridled optimism of millennials. Sarah Stankorb, writing for Vogue, said it differently. You were never cynical enough to be truly grunge, but not nearly as cheerfully helicopter-parented as millennial participation trophy kids. You exist in the middle, and that middle is psychologically exhausting. Here's what that means practically. You remember boredom, real boredom, the kind where you'd lie on your bedroom floor, staring at the ceiling for an hour with nothing to do. No smartphone, no endless scroll, just time passing slowly until you invented something to fill it. That boredom built creativity. It trained your brain to generate stimulation internally instead of seeking it externally. But you're also completely fluent in digital spaces. You can navigate any platform. You understand memes. You adapted because you had to. Australian researchers Andrew Fluck and Tony Dowden describe Xennials perfectly as straddling the two worlds of the ballpoint pen and the computer mouse. This creates a specific psychological tension. You're comfortable with technology, but you don't need it the way younger generations do. You can put your phone down at dinner, take tech-free vacations, sleep without checking your device, because you remember what life felt like without constant connectivity, and part of you misses it. Here's what makes the Oregon Trail generation psychologically unique. You're translators, bridges between two incompatible worlds. At work, you explain technology to older Gen X colleagues who still print emails. Then you turn around and explain analog processes to millennials and Gen Z who've never used a physical file system or understood why anyone would need to show up somewhere without texting first. One Xennial interviewed described the generation as workplace ninjas, people who can communicate with any age group because they learned both languages. You spoke on landlines. You remember having actual conversations with your friends' parents. But you're also the first generation that grew up with personal computers becoming normalized in homes. According to Dan Woodman, a professor at Melbourne University, this timing gave you advantages both generations around you lack. You experienced economic stability that Gen X didn't have in early adulthood. You launched careers before the 2008 recession destroyed entry-level opportunities for millennials. Sarah Stankorb called you the lucky ones because you landed in a fleeting sweet spot before the recession. But there's a cost to being the bridge. You're perpetually translating, but never fully belonging. Like a generational middle child, you've lost much of your cultural identity. When Gen X calls millennials entitled, you nod along. When millennials call Gen X laggards, you agree with that too. You see both sides because you lived both sides, and that makes it impossible to pick a team. Here's what sets you apart psychologically from every generation after you. You remember the before. You're the last generation that will ever know what it felt like to be completely unreachable. To leave your house and just be gone for hours with nobody able to contact you. No GPS tracking your location. No expectation of instant response. When you get together with other Oregon Trail generation friends, you talk about this constantly. How grateful you are that you survived middle school, high school, and college before social media documented everything. One Xennial put it perfectly. We all talked crazy amounts of shit about each other, took pictures of ourselves doing shockingly inappropriate things, and spread rumors like it was our jobs. But we just never had to worry about any of it ending up in a place where everyone and their moms could see it. Your mistakes disappeared. Your awkward phases weren't photographed and archived forever. You got to figure out who you were in private. And that privacy shaped how your identity formed in ways that can never be replicated. According to research, this created adults who value authenticity over performance. You're less likely to curate your life for an audience because you developed a sense of self before audiences existed. You're more comfortable with silence, with being alone, with not documenting everything, because you remember when that was normal. But here's the painful part. Most of your culture has vanished. You grew up watching My So-Called Life, Beverly Hills, 90210, and Friends. You listened to Nirvana and Guns N' Roses. You played Nintendo and Sega. You remember the Challenger explosion. You were teenagers during a relatively peaceful, pre-Columbine, pre-9/11 America. And now, you watch today's culture wars from the sidelines, confused. One Xennial writer described it perfectly. Xennials struggle to navigate the culture wars. We cannot come to terms with today's zeitgeist. You grew up believing you weren't special, that showing off was cringe, that megalomania and self-promotion were character flaws, not career strategies. And now you're watching a world where personal branding is survival, and visibility equals value. It's disorienting. But here's what remains. According to multiple sources, if Xennials have preserved one cultural hallmark, it's this. You still frown upon douchebaggery. That type of self-centered narcissism that defines modern me culture feels fundamentally wrong to you, because you learned early that being a good friend mattered more than being important. Here's what nobody tells you about being part of the Oregon Trail generation. You'll spend your life explaining yourself, defending your right to exist as separate from the generations that box you in, correcting people who lump you in with millennials, rolling your eyes when someone calls you Gen X. But here's what you actually are. You're the memory keepers, the last generation that will ever remember what the world was like before it went digital. The first generation that adapted fast enough to thrive in what came after. You're not better than other generations. You're different, shaped by timing. By being born at the exact moment when the old world was dying and the new one was being born. You straddle both. You belong fully to neither. And that's not weakness, that's perspective. You see what was lost, you understand what was gained, and you carry both truths without needing to pick a side. If this felt like someone finally understood you, you're not alone. This channel is for the generations nobody talks about, the ones who exist in the cracks between the labels. Subscribe to explore the psychology that makes you who you are. And if you're part of the Oregon Trail generation, drop your birth year in the comments. Let's see how many of us are still out here, quietly bridging worlds nobody else remembers existed. Because you're not confused about who you are. You're just the only ones who remember both sides.